Hi, in this video we'll look at how elasticity affects total spending or total revenue from the seller's standpoint. Think of a scenario where a product has become more expensive. You can relate to personal examples that come to mind. So let's say price has gone up, and so we're wondering what will end up happening to our total spending on that product. So as soon as we see this higher price, there's a temptation to conclude that we will end up spending more dollars on the product because of the higher price tag. But there's also the recognition that in response to the higher price, we would have a drop in the quantity demanded and quantity purchased. So the idea that we are buying less of the product leads to the other possibility that we might end up spending fewer dollars on that product. So from the store standpoint, a rise in the price, if they raise the price tag, may lead to a higher amount of revenue that people are spending, and but with the reduction in the quantity being bought, it could lead to a lower amount of revenue. So this is a critical question, both from a consumer standpoint and from a store's or a supplier's standpoint. What will happen to the total dollar amount of sales if price is raised, or in an alternate scenario if price is reduced. So let's look at how elasticity plays a role in this. To see that, let's first suppose that price went up, and I'm using, for visual purposes, two arrows to capture the degree of the price increase. The two arrows, it's an arbitrary visualization, but hopefully it will help. If price goes up by two arrows, and if the price elasticity of demand is on the small side, meaning if the demand is price inelastic, so if demand is price inelastic, then what? Well, the fact that it's inelastic basically is telling us that quantity will react, but it won't react proportionally. It will react less than proportionally. It's like if price had gone up by two arrows, quantity will drop, but not by two arrows. It'll drop less than proportionally, hence, let's say, one arrow. And to predict what will happen to total spending, or from the store standpoint revenue, simply compare the size of the arrows, the force that's dominating. So the upward force from price is dominating the downward force from reduced quantity, and so we would conclude that price times quantity, so when you multiply price with quantity, you get the total spending or total revenue, and we would say that overall this would show an increase. So we would have been right in speculating that total dollar amount spent by consumers would go up with this increased price. But that's because in this particular scenario, the quantity adjustment, the quantity reduction, is relatively little. So that's the scenario of price inelastic. If it was the opposite, if demand elasticity was much greater, so demand is price elastic, well, then what? Then that would tell us that the quantity response is quite large. How large? It's more than proportional compared to the initial price change. So if the price had gone up by, let's say, two arrows, then the quantity response, the quantity adjustment, which is downward, would be greater than two arrows. So let's say three arrows. Again, this is my way of visualizing the relative size of changes in price versus quantity. So if the demand is price elastic, quantity is being adjusted quite greatly, then the dominating force is no longer price over quantity. The dominating force, three arrows more than two arrows, the dominating force is the quantity adjustment. In that case, we see the net effect being a reduction in total dollar amount spent by consumers, total revenue earned by the sellers. If the demand were exactly in between being inelastic and elastic. In other words, if demand is unitary elastic, with respect to price, what would that imply? Well, unitary elasticity, meaning an elasticity value of 1, the magnitude being 1, would mean that quantity responds exactly proportionally to the price change. So if price change was that big, quantity adjustment would be equally large proportionally. So 2 arrows, which would cancel out, neither one dominates, and so we would be correct in speculating or predicting that the final change in total spending or total revenue is 0, meaning P times Q is unchanged. Look at the curving. Okay, so that's the impact of elasticity on spending versus the price changes. And in the case where a store is trying to figure out what to do in order to get more sales dollars, they would want to look at elasticity information. So for instance, if they knew that they're selling a product that has price inelastic demand and they wanted to increase their sales, then would they reduce the price to get more people to buy, or would they raise the price to get more dollars in? It turns out with price inelastic demand, raising the price would lead to greater dollar sales from the standpoint of the supplier. If they were facing price elastic demand, and if they wanted to raise the total dollar amount of sales, then raising the price would not do the trick. Raising the price would lose so many customers that they would end up actually seeing a lower amount of sales. So with price elastic demand, they would want to lower the price to get a huge response, or relatively a large response, from new customers coming in or customers buying much more than before, and that would generate a greater sale. So that would be an example whereby we have price being reduced, leading to quantity responding or getting adjusted quite largely. And so with elastic demand, a reduction in price would lead to total spending by consumers, or total revenue, total sales earned by the seller, would lead it to go up. So for pricing strategy, this is very, very useful. So stores, in marketing, they would look at this. From a consumer standpoint, in terms of budgeting and such relevant thought processes or calculations, again, the elasticity information is very, very useful. So it's just a take on how elasticity is applicable in these kinds of scenarios.